Presuming that most of you leave, as the work of Joan Didion might not expect us to, in a leisurely stroll rather than a stampede, I hope you'll pick up copies of 2 recent short stories from the table by the exit over there. One is by Alan Gerganis, the author of Oldest Living Confederate Widow Tells All, who'll be reading here on Tuesday, December 6th. And the other is by Edward P. Jones, winner of last year's Pulitzer Prize for The Known World, who will be reading here in February. I first read Joan Didion at UC Berkeley, where Miss Didion famously did not make Phi Beta Kappa. A generation later, she was still remembered by her teachers. Josephine Miles, the poet and legendary professor, who by the time I knew her was so crippled from MS that she had to be carried like a log over shoulder by a burly undergraduate on an athletic scholarship, recounted the spring her student won the Prix de Rome, given by Vogue magazine. Josephine Miles described Didion, small and seemingly shy, standing on top of her desk shouting, "I'm going to New York City." Talented girl, Miles said. Talented girl. Joan Didion went to New York and worked at Vogue with a flight scheduled to California in her desk drawer to remind her that she could go home again. I went to New York some 20 years later with a copy of her essay, Goodbye to All That, for much the same reason. I doubt that there is a writer of my generation who does not possess highlighted copies of Slouching Towards Bethlehem, the White Album, After Henry, and Where I Was From. Years before I had children, I witnessed an animated, frantic conversation about motherhood and writing. Animated and frantic is how those conversations still go, between Jane Ann Phillips and Gish Jen, concerning the details of Joan Didion's daycare arrangements when Quintana Roo was a baby. We all knew Quintana Roo's full name, and none of us were personally acquainted. Ms. Didion is a brilliant, eccentric reporter. I admire the crooked originality of her insight and her sound baseline of good sense. She is a collector. To give some indication of her record keeping and the length of time she is willing to wait for the necessary pieces of a story to emerge, I'll mention the collection After Henry, published in 1992, which uses, among other sources, her daybook from the 60s, a copy of the Bay Guardian from 1977 she happened to save for its article on the SLA, in which a puff piece about a San Francisco minister also appeared, comparing that minister to Cesar Chavez. The minister turned out to be the Reverend Jim Jones. Over the years, her essays have included a few stark details from her life, accounts of her migraines, the transcript of a neurological examination that described her state as near psychosis, and the mention of a week in Hawaii where she and her husband were in the middle of the Pacific in lieu of filing for divorce. But as readers of Didion know, these allusions are only a tease. Her sensibility is severe, adverse to allowances for itself, so apt to recoil from any bid for the reader's sympathy that these admissions seem themselves more revelatory about the times they chronicle than about the intimate life of their author. The character who does emerge is elusive, chic, and contrarian. In the early essays, we see the young Vogue editor from California plotting to open a shopping mall to support her fiction writing, intending to run it all out of her pale blue Condé Nast office. Didion once wrote, "I think now that we were the last generation to identify with adults." That identification, that's probably true, that identification may account for the vague and exhilarating aroma of glamour that comes off the pages of her essays about youth in New York and life as a married writer in Los Angeles, a glamour that is urban and illicit and deeply adult, even atavistically so. There are married men and drinks and opulence and flowers. She's less sentimental about the rich than F. Scott Fitzgerald, but just as drawn to them, as lush and killingly pointed in her descriptions. Didion tells us about a Los Angeles where women retired upstairs to dressing rooms after dinners, were served with finger bowls and doilies, each with its specific and codified ritualistic purpose. She says of Nancy Reagan's memoir, "My turn did not document a life radically altered by experience." People find it hard to place her essays, a circumstance which may explain why my old paperback copy of Slouching Towards Bethlehem is labeled on the back cover, Sociology. Her new book may be the most anomalous of all. It is an extended essay which reads like a novel about marriage, loss, and grief, called The Year of Magical Thinking, written by the writer one would think least subject to magical thinking. Ms. Didion's does seem to be a life radically altered by experience, a life tainted by survival, as she describes Patty Hearst's. A critic in the Atlantic Monthly claims, "No essayist has written more originally or wrenchingly about forsaking romance for emotional survival." In this book, Didion emerges as another anachronism, the well-married woman. She reveals herself to be a number of seeming oxymorons, a woman who has written all her adult life, who had matching gingham skirts whipped up for herself and her young daughter, who asked her editor to send her to Saigon when the news of My Lai broke, who pinned daisies behind her ears trying for a bride effect, who had nonetheless cried all through her wedding, during which she wore dark sunglasses. She is a woman who picked fights with her husband, accusing him of wanting a different kind of wife. In Pacific Distances, she writes about a brief teaching appointment at Berkeley, her alma mater, in 1975. Sitting in her office one afternoon, a young man came in and said he was a writer. I asked what he had written. "Nothing you'll ever dare to read," he said. He admired only Celine and Juna Barnes. With the exception of Juna Barnes, women could not write. It had been a couple of decades since I had last heard about Celine and Juna Barnes and how women could not write, since I last encountered that particular brand of extra-literary machismo. And after my caller had left the office, I locked the door and sat there a long time in the afternoon light. At 19, I had wanted to write. At 40, I still wanted to write, and nothing that had happened in the years between had made me any more certain that I could. At 69, in The Year of Magical Thinking, she writes about her birthday, December 5th, 2003. Snow had begun falling in New York around 10 that morning, and by evening 7 inches had accumulated with another 6 due. A plan to meet Quintana and Jerry at a restaurant had been canceled. Before dinner, John sat by the fire in the living room and read to me out loud. The book from which he read was a novel of my own, a book of common prayer, which he happened to have in the living room because he was rereading it to see how something worked technically. "God damn," John said to me when he closed the book. "Don't ever tell me again you can't write. That's my birthday present to you." I have my own Didion Dunne story. I was newly married, celebrating the publication of my second book, and in a corner of the restaurant, Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunne were leaning over a small table, their heads together, talking. They'd been married 30 years, and between them published more than a dozen books. I'd met them briefly, and I was going to go over and say hello, but, and those of you in the audience who've been married for a long time will understand how shocking this is, there was never a break in their conversation. Thank you. Joan Didion.
Thank you. I'm going to read from a part of this book, which takes place it's about 6 months after John died. And Quintana has been at UCLA having Medical Center she had neurosurgery in March. Sometime in June, after she had left UCLA and was in the 6th of what would be 15 weeks as an inpatient at the Rusk Institute of Rehabilitation Medicine at the New York University Medical Center in New York, Quintana told me that her memory not only of UCLA but of her arrival at Rusk was, quote, all mudgy. She could remember some things about UCLA, yes, as she could not yet remember anything else since before Christmas. She did not, for example, remember speaking at her father's service at St. John the Divine, nor when she first woke at UCLA did she remember that he had died. But it was still mudgy. Later she corrected this to smudgy, but she did not need to. I knew exactly what she meant. On the neuro floors at UCLA, they had called it spotty, as in her orientation is improving but still spotty. When I try to reconstruct those weeks at UCLA, I recognize the mudginess in my own memory. There are parts of days that seem very clear and parts of days that do not. I clearly remember arguing with the doctor the day they decided to do the tracheostomy. She had by then been intubated for about a week, for almost a week, the doctor said. UCLA did not leave tubes in for more than a week. I said that she had been intubated for 3 weeks at Beth Israel in New York. The doctor had looked away. The rule at Duke was also a week, he said, as if under the impression that the mention of Duke would settle the question for me. Instead, it enraged me. What is Duke to me, I wanted to say, but did not. What is Duke to UCLA? Duke is in North Carolina. UCLA is in California. If I wanted the opinion of somebody in North Carolina, I would call somebody in North Carolina. Her husband is right now on a flight to New York, I said instead. Surely this can wait until he lands. Not really, the doctor said, since it's already on the schedule. The day they decided to do the tracheostomy was also the day they turned off the EEG. Everything's looking good, they kept saying. She's going to get better sooner once we do the trach. She's already off the EEG. Maybe you didn't notice that. Maybe I didn't notice that. My only child, my unconscious child. Maybe I didn't notice that when I walked into the ICU that morning, her brain waves were gone, that the monitor above her bed was dark, dead. This was now being presented as progress, but it had not seemed so when I first saw it. I remembered reading once that the ICU nurses at San Francisco General turned off the monitors when a patient was near death, because their experience was that family members would focus on the screens rather than on the dying patient. I wondered if such a determination had been made in this case. Even after I was assured that this was not so, I found myself averting my eyes from the blank screen. I'd grown used to watching her brain waves. It was a way of hearing her talk. I did not see why, since the equipment was sitting there unused, they could not just keep the EEG on, just in case. I had asked. I do not remember getting an answer. It was a period when I asked many questions that did not get answered. What answers I did get tended to the unsatisfactory, as in, it's already on the schedule. Everyone in the neuro units got a trach, they had kept saying to me that day. Everyone in the neuro units had muscular weaknesses that rendered the removal of the breathing tube problematic. A trach involved less risk of windpipe damage. A trach involved less risk of pneumonia. Look to your right, look to your left. Both sides have trachs. A trach could be done with fentanyl and a muscle relaxant. She would be under anesthesia no more than an hour. A trach would leave no cosmetic effect to speak of, only a little dimple scar. As time goes by, maybe no scar at all. They kept mentioning this last point as if the basis for my resistance to the trach was the scar. They were doctors, however freshly minted. I was not. Ergo, any concerns I had must be cosmetic, frivolous. In fact, I had no idea why I so resisted the trach. I think now that my resistance came from the same fund of superstition from which I had been drawing since John died. If she did not have a trach, she could be fine in the morning, ready to eat, talk, go home. If she did not have a trach, we could be on a plane by the weekend. Even if they did not want her to fly, I could take her with me to the Beverly Wilshire. We could have our nails done, sit by the pool. If they still did not want her to fly, we could drive out to Malibu, spend a few restorative days with Jean Moore. If she did not have a trach. This was demented, but so was I. Through the printed blue cotton curtains that separated the beds, I could hear people talking to their functionally absent husbands, fathers, uncles, co-workers. In the bed to Quintana's right was a man injured in a construction accident. The men who had been at the site at the time of the accident had come to see him. They stood around his bed and tried to explain what had happened. The rig, the cab, the crane. I heard a noise. I called out to Vinnie. Each man gave his version. Each version differed slightly from the others. This was understandable, since each witness proceeded from a slightly different point of view. But I recall wanting to intercede, help them coordinate their stories. It had seemed too much conflicting data to lay on someone with a traumatic brain injury. Everything's going along as usual, and then all shit breaks loose, one said. The injured man made no response, nor could he, since he had a trach. To Quintana's left lay a man from Massachusetts who had been in the hospital for several months. He and his wife had been in Los Angeles visiting their children. There had been a fall from a ladder. He had seemed all right, one more perfectly ordinary day. And then he had some trouble speaking. Everything's going along as usual, and then all shit breaks loose. Now he had pneumonia. The children came and went. The wife was always there, pleading with him in a low, mournful voice. The husband made no response. He, too, had a trach. They did the trach for Quintana on the 1st of April, a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, enough of the sedation for the breathing tube had been metabolized out so that she could open her eyes and squeeze my hand. On Saturday, I was told that the next day or Monday she would be removed from the ICU into a step-down neuro-observational unit on the 7th floor. The 6th and 7th floors at UCLA were all neuro. I have no memory of when she was moved, but I think it was some days after that. One afternoon after she had been moved to the step-down unit, I ran into the woman from Massachusetts in the cafeteria courtyard. Her husband, too, had left the ICU and was moving now to what she called a subacute rehab facility. We each knew that subacute rehab facilities were what medical insurance carriers and hospital discharge coordinators called nursing homes, but this went unmentioned. She had wanted him moved to the 11-bed acute rehab unit at UCLA Neuropsychiatric, but he had not been accepted. That was the phrase she used, not been accepted. She was concerned about how she would get to the subacute facility. One of the two with an available bed was near LAX, the other in Chinatown, because she did not drive. The children had jobs, important jobs. They could not always be driving her. We sat in the sun. I listened. She asked about my daughter. I did not want to tell her that my daughter would be moving to the 11-bed acute rehab unit at neuropsychiatric. At some point I noticed that I was trying like a sheepdog to herd the doctors, pointing out edema to one intern, reminding another to obtain a urine culture to check out the blood in the Foley catheter line, insisting on a Doppler ultrasound to see if the reason for the leg pain could be emboli, doggedly repeating when the ultrasound indicated that she was in fact again throwing clots, that I wanted a specialist on coagulation called in to consult. I wrote down the name of the specialist I wanted. I offered to call him myself. These efforts did not endear me to the young men and women who made up the house staff. If you want to manage this case, I'm signing off, one finally said. But they made me feel less helpless. I remember learning at UCLA the names of many tests and scales, the Kimura box test, the two-point discrimination test, the Glasgow coma scale, the Glasgow outcome scale. My comprehension of the meaning of these tests and scales remained obscure. I also remember learning, both at UCLA and before at Beth Israel and Columbia Presbyterian, the names of many resistant hospital bacteria. At Beth Israel, there had been Acinetobacter baumannii, which was resistant to vancomycin. That's how you know it's a hospital infection. I recall being told by a doctor I asked at Columbia Presbyterian. If it's resistant to vanc, it's hospital, because vanc only gets used in hospital settings. At UCLA, there had been MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, as opposed to MRSE, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus epidermidis, which was what they had first thought they had cultured, which had seemed to more visibly alarm the staff. I can't say why, but because you're pregnant, you may want to transfer off, one therapist advised another during the MRSE scare, glancing at me as if I might not understand. There were many other names of hospital bacteria, but those were the big hitters. Whatever bacteria was shown to be the source of the new fever or urinary tract infection, it would mandate gowns, gloves, masks. It would provoke heavy sighing among the aides, who were required to suit up before entering the room to empty a wastebasket. The methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus at UCLA was an infection in the bloodstream, a bacteremia. When I heard this, I expressed concern to the doctor who was examining Quintana that an infection in her bloodstream might again lead to sepsis. Well, you know, sepsis is a clinical term, the doctor said, then continued examining her. I had pressed him. Well, she's already in some degree of sepsis. He seemed cheerful. But we're continuing vanc, and so far our blood pressure is holding. So we were back to waiting to see if she lost blood pressure. We were back to watching for septic shock. Next we would be watching for ice flows on the East River. In point of fact, what I watched from the windows at UCLA was a swimming pool. I never once saw anyone swim in this pool. Although it was filtered, I could see the little swirl where the water entered the filter and the bubbling where it reemerged, sparkling in the sun and surrounded by patio tables with parasols. One day when I was watching it, I had a sharp memory of having gotten the idea to float candles and gardenias in the pool behind the house in Brentwood Park. We were having a party. It was an hour before the party, but I was already dressed when the gardenia idea presented itself. I knelt on the coping and lit the candles and used the pool skimmer to guide the gardenias and candles into an attractively random pattern. I stood up, pleased with the result. I put the pool skimmer away. When I glanced back at the pool, the gardenias had vanished and the candles were out, tiny, drenched hulks bobbing furiously around the filter intake. They could not be sucked in because the filter was already clogged with gardenias. I spent the remaining 45 minutes before the party cleaning the sodden gardenias from the filter and scooping out the candles and drying my dress with a hairdryer. So far, so good, a memory of the house in Brentwood Park that involved neither John nor Quintana. Unfortunately, I thought of another. I had been alone in the kitchen of that house, late twilight, early evening, feeding the bouvier we then had. Quintana was at Barnard. John was spending a few days at the apartment we had in New York. This would have been late 1987, the period during which he had begun talking about wanting to spend more time in New York. I had discouraged this idea. Suddenly a red flashing light had filled the kitchen. I had gone to the window. There was an ambulance in front of a house across Marlborough Street, visible beyond the coral tree and the 2 cords of stacked wood in our side yard. This was a neighborhood in which many houses, including the one across Marlborough Street, had side yards in which there were 2 cords of stacked wood. I had watched the house until the last light was gone and the ambulance left. The next morning when I was walking the dog, a neighbor told me what had happened. 2 cords of stacked wood had not kept the woman in the house across Marlborough Street from becoming a widow at dinner. I had called John in New York. The red flashing light had by then seemed an urgent warning. I said maybe he was right, maybe we should spend more time in New York. Watching the empty swimming pool from the window at UCLA, I could see the vortex coming but could not deflect it. The vortex in this instance would be the memory's insistent appointment in Samara aspect. Had I not made that call, would Quintana have moved back to Los Angeles when she graduated from Barnard? Had she been living in Los Angeles, would Beth Israel North have happened? Would Presbyterian have happened? Would she be at UCLA today? Had I not misread the meaning of the red flashing light in late 1987, would I be able to get in my car today and drive west on San Vicente and find John at the house in Brentwood Park, standing in the pool rereading Sophie's Choice? Would I need to relive every mistake if by accident I remembered the morning we drove down to San Tropez from Tony Richardson's house in the hills and had coffee on the street and bought the fish for dinner? Would I also need to remember the night I refused to swim in the moonlight because the Mediterranean was polluted and I had a cut on my leg? If I remembered the gamecock at Portuguese Bend, would I also need to remember the long drive home from dinner to that house, and how many nights as we passed the refineries on the San Diego freeway, one or the other of us had said a wrong thing or stopped speaking or imagined that the other had stopped speaking? Quote, each single one of the memories and expectations in which the libido is bound to the object is brought up and hypercathected, and detachment of the libido is accomplished in respect of it. It is remarkable that this painful unpleasure is taken as a matter of course by us, unquote. So Freud explained what he saw as the work of grief, which as described sounded suspiciously like the vortex. In point of fact, the house in Brentwood Park from which I had seen the flashing red light and thought to evade it by moving to New York no longer existed. It was torn down to the ground and replaced by a house marginally larger a year after we sold it. The day we happened to be in Los Angeles and drove past the corner of Chadbourne and Marlboro and saw nothing left standing except the one chimney that allowed a tax advantage, I remembered the real estate agent telling me how meaningful it would be to the buyers were we to give them suitably inscribed copies of the books we had written in the house. We had done this, Quintana and Friends, Dutch Shade Jr., The Red, White, and Blue for John, Salvador Democracy in Miami for me. When we saw the flattened lot from the car, Quintana in the back seat burst into tears. My first reaction was fury. I wanted the books back. Did this corrective line of thinking stop the vortex? Not hardly. One morning when Quintana was still on the step down because the persistence of her fever necessitated an echocardiogram to rule out endocarditis, she lifted her right hand for the first time. This was significant because it was the right side of her body, on the right side of her body, that the effects of the trauma could be seen. Movement meant that the traumatized nerves remained alive. Later that day, she kept wanting to get out of bed and fell into a sulk like a child when I said I would not help her. My memory of that day is not at all mudgy. It was decided late in April that sufficient time had passed since the surgery to allow her to fly to New York. The issue until then had been pressurization and the potential for swelling. She would need trained personnel to accompany her. A commercial flight was ruled out. Arrangements were made to medevac her, an ambulance from UCLA to an airport, an air ambulance to Teterboro, and an ambulance from Teterboro to New York University Hospital, where she would do neuro rehab. Many conversations were held between UCLA and the Rusk Institute at NYU. Many records were faxed. A CD-ROM of CAT scans was prepared. A date was set for what even I was now calling the transfer, Thursday, April 29. Early that Thursday morning, as I was about to check out of the Beverly Wilshire, I got a call from somewhere in Colorado. The flight had been delayed. The plane was in Tucson, where it had landed with mechanical difficulties. The mechanics in Tucson would look at it when they came in at 10 Mountain Time. By early afternoon Pacific Time, it was clear that the plane would not be flying. Another plane would be available the next morning, but the next morning was a Friday, and UCLA did not like to transfer on Fridays. At the hospital, I pressed the discharge coordinator to agree to the Friday transfer. To delay the transfer into the following week would dispirit and confuse Quintana, I said, sure of my ground. Rusk had no problem with a Friday night admission, I said, less sure. There was nowhere I could stay over the weekend, I lied. By the time the discharge coordinator agreed to the Friday transfer, Quintana was asleep. I sat for a while in the sun on the plaza outside the hospital and watched helicopters landing on the roof. Helicopters were always landing on the roof at UCLA, suggesting trauma all over Southern California, remote scenes of highway carnage, distant falling cranes, bad days ahead for the husband or wife or mother or father who had not yet, even as the helicopter landed and the trauma team rushed the stretcher into triage, not yet gotten the call. I remembered a summer day in 1970 when John and I stopped for a red light in New Orleans and noticed the driver of the next car suddenly slump over his steering wheel. His horn sounded. Several pedestrians ran up. A police officer materialized. The light changed. We drove on. John had been unable to get this image out of his mind. There he was, he had kept saying later. He was alive and then he was dead and we were watching. We saw him at the instant it had happened. We knew he was dead before his family did. Just an ordinary day and then gone. The day of the flight, when it came, had seemed to unfold with the non-sequential inexorability of a dream. When I turned on the news in the early morning, there was a guerrilla action on the freeways, truckers protesting the price of gasoline. Huge semis had been deliberately jackknifed and abandoned on Interstate 5. Witnesses reported that the first semis to stop had carried the TV crews. SUVs had been waiting to take the truckers themselves from the blocked freeway. The video, as I watched it, had seemed dislocatingly French, 1968. Avoid the 5 if you can, the newscaster advised, then warned that according to sources, the truckers would also block other freeways, specifically the 710, the 60, and the 10. In the normal course of this kind of disruption, it would have seemed unlikely that we could get from UCLA to the plane. But by the time the ambulance arrived at the hospital, the entire French event had seemed to have dematerialized, that phase of the dream forgotten. There were other phases to come. I had been told the plane would be at the Santa Monica airport. The ambulance crew had been told Burbank. Someone made a call and was told Van Nuys. When we reached Van Nuys, there were no planes, only helicopters. That must be because you're going by helicopter, one of the ambulance attendants said, clearly ready to hand us off and get on with his day. Well, I don't think so, I said. It's 3,000 miles. The ambulance attendant shrugged and disappeared. The plane was located, a jet Cessna with room for the 2 pilots, the 2 paramedics, the stretcher to which Quintana was strapped, and if I sat on a bench over the oxygen canisters, me. We took off. We flew for a while. One of the paramedics had a digital camera and was taking pictures of what he kept calling the Grand Canyon. I said I believed it was Lake Mead, Hoover Dam. I pointed out Las Vegas. The paramedic continued taking pictures. He also continued referring to it as the Grand Canyon. Why do you always have to be right? I remembered John saying. It was a complaint, a charge, part of a fight. He never understood that in my own mind I was never right. Once in 1971, when we were moving from Franklin Avenue to Malibu, I found a message stuck behind a picture I was taking down. The message was from someone to whom I had been close before I married John. He had spent a few weeks with us in the house on Franklin Avenue. This was the message: you were wrong. I did not know what I had been wrong about, but the possibilities seemed infinite. I burned the message. I never mentioned it to John. All right, I thought, it's the Grand Canyon. I shifted position on the bench over the oxygen canister so that I could no longer see out the window. Later, we landed in a cornfield in Kansas to refuel. The pilots struck a deal with the 2 teenagers who managed the airstrip. During refueling, they would take their pickup to a McDonald's and bring back hamburgers. While we waited, the paramedic suggested that we take turns getting exercise. When my turn came, I stood frozen on the tarmac for a moment, ashamed to be free and outside when Quintana could not be. then walked to where the runway ended and the corn started. There was a little rain and unstable air, and I imagined a tornado coming. Quintana and I were Dorothy. We were both free. In fact, we were out of here. John had written a tornado into nothing lost. I remembered reading the last past galleys in Quintana's room at Presbyterian and crying when I hit the passage with the tornado. The protagonists, J.J. McClure and Teresa Kane, see the tornado, quote, in the far distance, black and then milky when the sun caught it, moving like a huge reticulated vertical snake. J.J. tells Teresa not to worry. This stretch has been hit before. Twisters never hit the same place twice. The tornado, quote, the tornado finally set down without incident across the Wyoming line. That night in the Stepperite Inn at the junction between Higginson and Higgins, Teresa asked if it was true that tornadoes never hit the same place twice. I don't know, J.J. said. It seemed logical. Like lightning, you were worried. I didn't want you worried. It was as close a declaration of love as J.J. was capable of making. Back in the plane alone with Quintana, I took one of the hamburgers the teenagers had brought and tore it into pieces so that she and I could share. After a few bites, she shook her head. She had been allowed solid food for only a week and could not eat more. There was still a feeding tube in place in case she could not eat at all. Am I going to make it, she asked then. I chose to believe that she was asking if she would make it to New York. Definitely, I told her. I'm here, you're safe. Definitely she would be okay in California, I remembered telling her 5 weeks before. That night when we arrived at the Rusk Institute, Jerry, her husband, and her cousin Tony were waiting outside to meet the ambulance. Jerry asked how the flight had been. I said that we had shared a Big Mac in a cornfield in Kansas. It wasn't a Big Mac, Quintana said, it was a quarter pounder.
Do you want to ask questions and I will call on you? Don't be shy.
We have a couple of mics, so if you just raise your hand and remember to stand up when you're asking the question, we'll come back.
Yes, sir, in the back. Or you can just shout out and I'll repeat the question too.
No.
Either way. Okay.
Wait for the mic there, so everybody.
Ms. Didion, thank you so much for the reading. As a physician at UCLA and a medical student at NYU, I wanted to particularly thank you for this book because it is an absolutely extraordinary exploration of grief and what it means for loved ones to no longer be there. And it's sort of a social and national issue. Americans, we do very poorly with grief and with death, and this is a significant contribution to our experience of that, and I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. I'm sorry I mispronounced so many medical words. I just didn't get it.
You pronounce fewer medical words incorrectly than I do, so I'm impressed with your capacity to do so. My question relates to the structure and style of the book. Much of writing about grief is highly metaphoric in its content. And I've always found that it's a way of sort of distancing ourselves from what's actually happening. And I was very struck by this book and the utter lack of metaphor in the book. And it seemed to me that in its stead, you had sort of replaced it with the tremendous specificity of memory that sort of developed in this beautiful elliptical spiral. It sort of reminded me a lot of the writing of W.G. Sebald, particularly in Austerlitz, when he's writing about grief so poignantly of this sort of overwhelming loss of an entire generation of people. And I guess my question is, did this sort of come to you in the process of writing the book, or was this really sort of how you felt and experienced the entire process?
I felt that what I wanted to do, if I was going to do this, and I didn't start out doing it. John died on December 30th, and because Quintana was in and out of the hospital, and then I had to do a couple of pieces. I didn't start pulling my notes together. I mean, I wanted to pull the notes together about her hospitalization in case I needed them later for, in case, because she was still doing neuro rehab as an outpatient. And so there were a lot of doctors' names and things that I wanted to have typed. So I started typing them, and then I noticed that among these, I'd made some notes while I was sitting around various hospitals about how I felt about John dying, etc. And so I started typing those too. But I was still just typing notes, and then after about 3 days, I realized that I was wondering what the structure could possibly be. And then I realized I was thinking about a book, and the structure was meant to be. The only possible structure that I hit on was to replicate the experience, which is obsessive. You just play and replay the same scene, and it seemed to me that would work. That would convey that was the only way I could hope to convey in any kind of raw way the nature of the experience. And I wanted to do it raw. A lot of accounts of grief are kind of recollected in tranquility. When people have come to some resolution. I wanted to do it unresolved because nobody had ever told me what that was like.
I remember Primo Levi, talking about writing his most central and urgent material, said that at that time he felt any questions of style were ridiculous.
Ridiculous, yeah. But you still wonder about structure.
No, structure's a different matter.
Yeah, I wanted to get style out of this. I didn't think, in fact, I was trying not to write it. I was trying to do it in as flat a tone as possible. Norman Mailer used for the Executioner's Song, he used a limited vocabulary. He used vocabulary that is used by people with limited education in this country. I can't remember how many words it was, but it was a very limited number of words, and it was an odd, and I realized that to some extent that's what I was trying to do without not doing it in terms of vocabulary. But for example, I deliberately didn't do transitions.
And as you said, it's devoid of metaphor in that way. More questions? I know you're out there. Yes, sir. The front here, James.
I was just wondering, due to the nature of this work, do you want to continue creating another major work afterwards, or because I could see it conceivable that some authors would just like to go out on a particular note due to the nature.
I don't want to. No. No, that's not. I don't. Of course, I want to continue working.
I'm glad to hear that.
Given how many forms you've written in, you've written splendid novels, you've written essays, and you've even written movies.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense of what will be?
No, I don't know what I'm going to do next because I haven't hit on it yet. I kept thinking on some airplane in the next. I kept thinking on some airplane in these weeks I will think of it, but airplanes are not as conducive to thought as they used to be.
That's funny. Another question? I think people are shy because I can tell the energy is here. Yes. Tori.
Okay, hello. I was wondering if the title, particularly Magical Thinking, if that was influenced by any philosophies that you've looked into or religions, or if that was something that was completely original that you came up with.
No, I wasn't. Not original at all. I used to, or at one point actually, when I was writing a Book of Common Prayer, I think, I was reading a lot of anthropology because the narrator of that book was an anthropologist. And magical thinking is a sort of common term among anthropologists. It describes a kind of thinking which is common among tribal people. Sort of, if you sacrifice the virgin, then the crops will come in. And that's kind of the kind of thinking that people in grief engage in. If you do such and such, if I, for example, believed at some level that if I agreed to an autopsy, and if I in fact encouraged an autopsy, that they might find that what was wrong with John was so minor that it could be corrected. I mean, you know, of course I knew that wasn't true, but I believed it.
That's so striking in the book, because you're going along quite logically, and then you write that, of course, you couldn't possibly throw out his shoes.
Right, because he would need his shoes if he was coming back. And if I threw them out, he couldn't come back. Or it gave them away, or did whatever you do with shoes.
There's a question back there, James.
Mine isn't really a question, but I just loved when I think you came back from California and you were looking at a notepad and you had taken some notes, and on the back of the notepad was your marketing list of Evian bottles and flaxseed. And it just, for those of us who have grieved, it is so wonderful to be able to come back and see the tangible stuff there, the marketing list. And I thank you, because I think that most people don't get a chance to read a book that talks about grieving, but it talks about what life was like before.
Well, this, and what was written on that pad, I mean, the notes that was written on that pad was Quintana's husband had called from UCLA it was the day of the surgery, and he had called with what the doctor said they had found. So it was pretty shocking. I mean, it was sort of shocking stuff to see in the middle of my grocery list, the words "brain push to left side," you know.
Yes, there's a question over here.
I too want to thank you. That was a wonderful reading, and I really enjoyed the book. And as an anthropologist at UCLA, I appreciate the reference to anthropology. But you also quoted from one of Freud's famous papers on grief and mourning. And that paper actually has been used by some of the most notable theorists of so-called stage theories of grief, in which it's often implied that grief can be resolved after a certain period of time. And I was just curious what you thought about these stage theories of grief and whether they mesh with your own experience in any way at all.
I did not find Kubler-Ross, it didn't seem to apply to my experience. That was not so much, it seemed to me those stages were not about the survivor's grief, but about the grief of the person who is, or the psychology of the person who has been told that he or she will die, the dying person. So I don't know. I mean, my own experience was kind of unusual because it was complicated by Quintana's being ill. No, I don't really know.
Right, what it would have been like in another story. How could one know? More questions? Yes, how about over here?
Do you have a favorite book that you've written, or one that you feel is your best book?
You don't ever really feel that something is your best book. Sometimes you have favorites, and they're usually ones that have been over. I wrote a novel. It was kind of a romance of a Iran-Contra, and it didn't. Which I really like a lot, and I think one of the reasons I like it was it didn't really find an audience, you know. It was called The Last Thing He Wanted.
Yes, sir. Over here.
Because of all that you've lately endured, you're now possessing of a special wisdom that you didn't have before. And I'm wondering if you've come away from all of these sad days with a sense of the meaning of life.
No, I did not come away from these sad days with a sense of the meaning of life. I didn't find much, and this has to do with the stages too. I don't think you find resolution in these things. There comes a point at which you kind of integrate. There comes a point at which you believe the thing happened. I mean, for the first reaction is not to believe that it happened. There comes a point where you accept that it happened and you continue, and you either do or don't continue living. But no, I didn't find the meaning of life. I found I got a little more relaxed and a little less rigid than I had been, because what I realized is that I had no control over other people or life and death itself. So that's a relaxing thought.
It seemed to me the ending of your book did seem to imply a kind of, it's certainly a meditation on the compromises involved in survival.
Mm-hmm.
You're certainly in a different state than...
It's a difference, yeah.
...than before. Sir, you had a question?
Yes, thank you for your reading. I enjoyed it very much. I must admit I'm only about a third of the way through your memoir, but I'm wondering, was there a therapeutic process in your writing of this book?
Two things. One, I didn't think of it as a memoir when I was writing it. I thought of it as a book about grief. The memoir aspects came in because they do during grief. I mean, so, but I wasn't thinking of it as a memoir, which is slightly different. Then it got memoir put on it. I think in its Library of Congress catalog thing calls it a memoir. But
a great deal of research in the book, though.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be a handbook, kind of. Now, what was the second part? The second part of the question was it therapeutic? I suppose it was. Yeah, I think it enabled me because of the special circumstance. I had simply put off dealing with or even thinking about the fact that John had died, or dealing with it at any level. I'd put it off for 6 months because I couldn't afford to think about it. And now, at a time when I could afford to think about it, it was useful to simply sit down and do this kind of automatic writing, which, without a whole lot of thinking about it, I just wrote things down as they came to mind, which was sort of therapeutic, I guess. Yes.
First, I wanted to say how sorry I am for your losses. Your husband, who is a writer, I very much loved, and your daughter, which is a mother, I think is probably all of our worst fears. I just wanted to tell you how well I thought you caught the aspect of grief in which you feel transparent and exposed so much of the time.
Isn't that interesting? I really came to understand the point of mourning. I'd always thought it was mourning was a Victorian custom meant to show respect for the dead, or that's not it at all. It's to make you. It's like entering a place where nobody can see you or touch you. It keeps you private. I mean, I really wished that I could be in mourning, could wear mourning. I wished I could wear a veil for that matter.
How is it being on book tour to talk about this?
Well,
opposite
it's
of
not.
that.
It's different. I found it quite difficult the first time I did it, but I find my reactions are a little different, I mean, than they usually are in this kind of situation, because I really sort of, I'm a little less focused,
Well, and it's kind of all there in the book too.
Yeah, it's not anything that you can really go much further with.
Yes, over there.
I have to thank you because I felt that I've had some company. My husband died 2 weeks after your husband died. And my sense of grieving was not the one. I have 2 daughters. In fact, my youngest daughter was Quintana Roo's big sister in high school.
Oh.
And I thought, well, I'm not sitting there crying with a black veil either. And the sense of grieving that you portray was something that I could relate to and helped me feel better about not being veiled.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
There was a question right here. I guess it's you.
In the middle there?
Is
that what you said?
There's a woman
Oh,
right
I'm
here.
sorry.
How can you see?
Hi, I want to say, first of all, the picture on the back cover of the book on the deck in Malibu is just amazing. It just is so haunting to see that. Did you find any solace in any writers or in any music when you were going through this?
I started listening to certain music that I hadn't listened to before. There was a certain Schubert piano sonata I kept listening to that I had never played before. I mean, or maybe I had, but I hadn't particularly had it on all the time. I didn't find a whole lot of. I did not find a whole lot to read. Maybe I had no concentration. There's an interesting thing about that picture on the back, which is the day it was taken. It was taken by a Time Life photographer, and he wanted to come back. He'd taken some pictures, and then he wanted to come back an hour later because the sun would be lower, and he wanted that light. And so we all went our ways for an hour, and then that picture was taken. And it wasn't until I saw it in print that I realized that Quintana who was then probably 10, had utilized the hour by putting on eye makeup for the first time.
So is the picture from the later hour or the earlier hour?
This is the later hour. You can see the liner.
That's very funny. I think there's couple more questions over there.
Hi. You seem like one of the least self-pitying writers I've ever read. And I was wondering, in the very first lines of the book, where you talk about the question of self-pity immediately after John's death. And I was wondering why it is that you think that occurred to you.
Well, because I was really feeling sorry for myself. And I could see that this was going to be a huge problem.
I suspect that is not a problem subject to the stages theory.
No.
There's another question.
I'm also a physician.
Sir, just 1 second. We'll get you a microphone so everyone can hear you. Thank you.
I'm also a physician, and over a career, I do take care of a lot of people who are experiencing bereavement and grief. And they come to me, it's not difficult to distinguish with them the difference between depression and grief, and no one really comes in seeking antidepressants.
Mm-hmm.
But they're really, it's hard to console the unconsolable, and a lot of them have really no resources for finding solace or consolation. So many of them come in very anxious and seeking anti-anxiety medications. grief becomes medicalized. And it's hard for me to tell them to go home and process out this natural feeling that we all have to go through, and to take medications which in some way dilute or cause their grief or bereavement to be incomplete. But almost all the time I will give them something. So what are your feelings about medicating grief, especially in its acute phase?
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't find it. I had some medication, and I didn't find it helped. It didn't really. It didn't seem to cut through the. So I don't know. I mean, I don't. There are points when you sort of want it to get through the day. I mean, for example, I couldn't afford to grieve when Quintana was sick, so it was sort of important to me not to give way to it. Had I been able to give way to it, it might have been useful not to medicate, not to. But I couldn't.
You were making decisions. You were making critical decisions.
Yeah.
There's a couple questions right in the middle back there.
This is a very simple question, actually. In the book, you talk about seeing yourself through your husband's eyes, and then later seeing yourself at an older age, no longer being able to see yourself through his eyes. And there's a line in Goodbye to All That I always think of, that there was a song on the radio that played, "Where's the schoolgirl who used to be me?" And sometimes you would think about that line. And I was wondering if you still think of that and what the schoolgirl would think of you now.
No, I lost the schoolgirl. I mean, I lost the schoolgirl when at around the point I was writing that piece. Then I started thinking of myself as 29, you know. And I just stayed there, you know, until John died.
One more question.
Hi, I was at your talk yesterday at USC, and you had described yourself as a fearful person, and I was wondering if death was one of those things that you had once feared.
What was one of those things that I had once feared?
If death was one of those things.
Death I never even thought about, because I totally denied it, the possibility. So no, I wasn't afraid of it. I was afraid of death for someone else, not for John. I was afraid. I think we all worry that our children will die. So I was kind of panicked always that I might have left, you know, a bottle of Drano under the sink or something, or there might be a rattlesnake, or there might be an automobile. You know, all those things.
Let's have one more question. That's the end.
I want to thank you so much for all your writings over the years. I want to thank you so much for all your writings over the years, and particularly this one. I lost both my parents about 2 years ago, and it wasn't until I read this book that I fully understood a lot of what I was feeling, and I wanted to thank you for that. In your book, you talk about John being Irish and Catholic. I'm Irish and Catholic as well. And I wonder what comforted me when my parents died, and other partners and friends that have died over the years, in regards to my faith, is the belief that I will see them again at some point after I die. And I was wondering what your thoughts on that are.
Well, I naturally, I wish I could believe that, but I don't. I don't think I will. I mean, I know, I'm pretty sure.
Well, there's Julia Child.
Julia Child, on the other hand, I thought John and Julia Child were probably together having dinner. I mean, I was really, but that was because I was going through a phase, you know.
which is kind of Irish, you know. It was,
Another kind of magical thinking. Thank you so much. Miss Didion will go upstairs to the bookstore now to sign books. And you can